Hi everyone, it's me, Arden Lee, and today's video answers a question that was asked by one of the members of the Repatterning Parlor. And essentially, the question is, once we have integrated the ability to recognize harm and manipulation in our communities, how do we discern between using our abilities to help and support transformation and harm reduction, and how do we discern how to do that without also burning ourselves out or risking putting ourselves in harm's way? To expand a little bit on this question, this person asked the question and said basically, hey, myself and some other people, have grown up with, being familiar with harm, narcissistic abuse, manipulation, predatory behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And we've, grown past that point of releasing our sort of ingrained fawn response behavior, right? The survival mechanism we may have picked up along the way to enable and placate people who are engaging in that harmful behavior as a way of protecting ourselves. We're no longer in those patterns, and we've called our energy back to ourselves, but we notice it in our communities, in our workplaces. And how do we intervene in a way that's helpful, because we understand what's going on when a lot of other people don't, while also being true to ourselves and our boundaries and not giving it excess energy? This is a great question, because one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is how an expanded consciousness, such an overused phrase, but what I mean by that is that when we grow, when we learn, when we expand our worldviews, when we have a higher perspective for the ways that many things in the world work, it can start to get a little lonely, right? They don't call it the perilous path for nothing. It gets to a point where, I always tell people there are reasons for our prior unconsciousness. That phrase, ignorance is bliss, right? We can go about being unconscious of the way that things are happening or unfolding, and we're just unbothered, right? We're just walking around being unbothered by the world. Those are the people who, for example, don't follow our global or political crises, don't look into what they're actually eating when they buy something from McDonald's, they don't look deeper into what's actually going on so they can create a greater understanding of the mechanics of the way that the world around them is working. This includes things such as predatory, harmful, narcissistically abusive behavior. And it can be difficult when we know things that others don't know. It can be difficult to just kind of leave people alone and let them be wrong about the world. It can be difficult to know when it's helpful for us to intervene in situations. Our increased knowledge, our acquired sensitivity, our deepened intuition are all gifts. And I want to make the point first and foremost that we are never under an obligation to extend our energy to use them. We are never under an obligation to extend our energy to use them. We are called, each in our own way, to use whatever bandwidth we've been able to create for ourselves to contribute to making the world a better and more sustainable place, certainly. I think that's essentially what it is to have a soul calling. But in terms of individual circumstances, we are never obligated to extend our energy. I say that first and foremost because for those of us coming out of people-pleasing patterns and fawn responses, it's very easy to transfer that fawn response from originally perhaps placating or enabling a narcissistic abuser. What do we do with all that energy when we get it back to ourselves? The next place we might want to put all of that energy is preventing that harm from happening. And that's great, and it's a good impulse, and part of the reason I'm making this video is to talk about how that energy can best be used. But I want to make that point that we're not obligated, because in many instances, that flow of energy that we are so accustomed to giving to other people because we're stuck in a people-pleasing pattern or a fawn response can very easily just get transferred to feeling obligated to help and support and be of service, almost to the point where we get our identity from being someone helpful who adds value, right? Is any of this sounding familiar, right? Because that was so familiar to our previous patterns that it's very easy to just shift that ever so slightly and end up in a place where we're actually attached to helping so much that it can be unhealthy for us and unhealthy for the situation. So first and foremost, let's start with that even playing field, right? Your gifts are yours, and you get to decide and choose when it's appropriate and beneficial to all involved, that's including yourself, for you to bring them online and put them to good use. So I'm going to say that first. If you're looking at a situation where harm is happening, the first thing that I would do is I would go to a trusted friend who's someone outside that situation, and I would say, here's what's happening, and I'm unsure about how I should get involved. Often, a friend whose judgment you trust will help you to be that second set of eyes, and also help you to see where, is this your lane? Is this something that you can, offer support with, but then kind of back off? What is the reality of the situation that you're dealing with in front of you? There's many, many types of situations where we can be witnessing or experiencing harm in communities, and I don't want to paint them all with one label. There are certain situations where intervention is going to be something that is in our hearts. We can't stand by and just watch this happen and just remain placid about it. And there are going to be some situations where something is ongoing, and the best you can do is step back and perhaps offer support to people who are involved, but ultimately to not be attached to whether they take you up on it or not. Figuring out whether something is your lane is very, very key, and that's going to be unique to each situation. So that's why I advise to first get a second set of eyes on the situation that you trust and who will help you to understand what level of involvement on your part is going to be the most beneficial to everyone in the situation. From there, what I'm going to say is that this person asked, sometimes I'm the only person who really knows or sees what's going on, other than, the person who is the survivor. If that's the case, then your number one priority should be giving the survivor support. You want to, if you're the only person who can validate for them what's going on and help and happening to them, that might be the most helpful thing that you can do, is to witness them and say, what do you need to take care of yourself? How can I help you get through this part? I think a lot of times we want to put on our superhero capes and we want to, make a big intervention and stop the harm. And we have to sometimes ask ourselves whether that's coming from a place of ego and whether that's actually helpful to the person who is in the situation, who is experiencing the harm. So if you do decide that you want to put your energy into a situation, I believe that the first thing after making that decision is to go to the person who needs the most support. And that's going to be, in that situation, that's going to be the survivor. Maybe the best way for you to intervene in this situation is not by doing a great big call out and, rousing everyone into awareness. Maybe what the survivor actually wants and needs in that situation is just someone to talk to privately. Maybe they're dealing with it, but it's really stressful and they actually need help doing something else, such as, babysitting their kids for a night while they take some time off to do some processing, or some help with their groceries for the week as they're managing the extra stress of dealing with someone else's predatory or abusive behavior. Making sure that we prioritize the feelings of the survivor over our own ego to intervene is also very, very, very important. Now, what else can we do moving forward? Again, all of these are very, very situational, so I'm trying to make the generalizations that are going to be the most helpful. But of course, another thing that I want to emphasize is, let's say that you are friends with the person who is harming. There's often a very fine line. In fact, it's not even a line. It's not even a spectrum. It's a whole realm of infinite possibility between someone who is harming on purpose, who is aware of what they're doing and the manipulations that they're causing, and someone who is simply acting out of unconscious patterns that they've learned other places. I'm even going to say there's not that much distinction between those two things, because everyone is repeating patterns that they've learned have worked. And some people may be more aware of them than others. But if they were really aware of the fact that they were being a narcissistic abuser, if they were really aware of it, they would see how that was damaging their relationships and they would make a change in themselves. So everyone is somewhere in the field of awareness on their behavior and the harm that they're causing. Everyone is somewhere between unconsciousness and consciousness, right? And if we are friends with the person who is doing this behavior, then we have a really good, important opportunity to work with them toward greater awareness in a way that helps them change, and that essentially what I'm trying to say is, if everyone makes the person who's harming the enemy and puts a whole bunch of labels on them, like they're a narcissist, they're a predator, they're an abuser, even in cases where those labels may be helpful to warn others, it's very rarely going to be helpful to the person who's harming, because they're not going to want to think of themselves in that way. And even by applying that label, narcissist, predator, abuser, you're saying that's what you are and you can't change. So if you are someone who's friends with someone who is perpetuating harm, especially unconsciously, but with an understanding that all harm is on some level unconscious, because if we were really conscious of it and how it was destroying our relationships around us and how it wasn't working for the greater good of everybody, and how we have to work for the greater good of everybody in order to survive and function as societies, as a species, etc., then we would have a much different relationship to that. If we understood that life is not a zero-sum game, we understood that we are moving into a paradigm of sustainability and omni-consideration so that our species can survive in this critical juncture, then our thoughts about harm would be very different. So assuming that everyone who harms is doing so on some level unconscious of their overall impact. Even if they're conscious that they're harming, I don't think it's helpful to assume that their consciousness of their harm is so great that they must retain that label forever. Again, these are tricky circumstances with a lot of different individual unique expressions. But essentially, if we have the position of being friends with someone who is harming, then we have the opportunity to bring them back by gently letting them know what's going on and helping them to transform. I've worked with people who have perpetuated unconscious harm in the past, and their defense systems were so riled up about it that when they first came to me, they really wanted to shut down and completely say that everything that had been said about them was false and this was unfair and whatever. And by taking the time to say, hey, I'm sure you didn't mean for any of this to happen, but did you know that sometimes you can do things in certain ways that you don't intend, but they're still perceived that way by the other people involved because it still had an impact on them that you weren't maybe aware of? And they're like, wow, is that really? Yes, that's true. Now we can have a conversation. Now we can start to talk about things like fawn response. Now we can start to talk about, what it looks like when other people, may perceive you, for example, as an authority figure. Let's talk about instances in which people feel like maybe they can't say no to you or won't say no to you. Let's talk about people who don't necessarily have a good understanding of their own boundaries before they go into an agreement with you, right? There are all sorts of different ways that this can happen. And you can educate someone on the ways that their actions may come across in ways that allow them to understand how they may have created a harmful impact even if they didn't intend it. I think that's really important. It's really possible to polarize these things and say, oh, that person's bad or that person did this. And there's been, certainly in the last several years, a lot of finger pointing that comes up with a raised awareness and consciousness of the harms that so many of us in the collective are capable of perpetuating. But there's got to be that opportunity for a return to grace, right? For a return to the tribe, to the community. I say tribe because, as I'm learning in this amazing book, Disrupting the Bystander by A.V. Flax, which, by the way, I would not be able to make this video as clearly and concisely as I am now if I had not been reading this book, which I highly recommend. A.V. is also a member of the Repatterning Parlor, by the way, so you can also see her in the group. And if you have questions about this amazing work, I definitely encourage you to reach out to her. Such a good book. But I use that word tribe specifically because many of the practices of transformative justice that we use today in community harm reduction originated with indigenous peoples and what they referred to as peacemaking circles, where they would support the person who experienced the harm and they would bring back the person who did the harm and create, once again, symbiosis and equilibrium within their community. So I don't use that word tribe lightly. I want to explain the background behind that. So if that's something that you're seeing and you're experiencing, that's how I would approach it. First of all, discern, with maybe the help of a second set of eyes, whether it's your lane. Offer support to the survivor first and foremost, and make sure that any plan that you have to intervene goes along with the survivor's wishes, because the survivor absolutely is the person who needs to be centered first and foremost in a harmful situation. And finally, if you are in the position where you have a personal intimacy with the person who is creating harm, how can you make them aware and call them back in? And also, you guys, you can outsource this. In one of the situations in which I helped a person understand how they might be perpetuating harm that they were not conscious of, I outsourced a lot of that education work to a friend of mine, Reed Mahalko, who had just undergone his own year-long accountability process, because also that was something that would be useful to him to share about, because we also learn better when we teach others. So when this person called me up and said, uh-oh, I think that, some Me Too stuff has been made up about me, I said, well, let me have you talk to someone who might be able to teach you how to handle this a little more gracefully. So you can also outsource this work to other people who are doing their own accountability processes, whom you trust to have a great enough understanding that they can work also with a person who is confronting harm that they have created, perhaps without knowing it. And at the end of the day, do remember that this energy is your energy. And while we are all called to serve in a higher capacity and to use our bandwidth, our creative freedom to make the world a better and more sustainable place, we are never obligated to jump into any specific situation just because we are accustomed to giving our energy to other people. It's just a good thing to keep in mind. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you guys. I'll see you next time.